So hello everybody, and welcome to Social Capital. APLU's Commission on Innovation, Competitiveness, and Economic Prosperity, or CICEP for short, is excited to present this series of webinars exploring what makes innovation ecosystems work. In the series, we've been looking at university partnerships with industry, with government, and with communities. And we're examining these partnerships from every angle and taking a look at how partners build trust and cooperate to achieve shared goals. So we'd like to say thanks to all of you who joined us today. We're glad you're taking time out of your day to join the conversation. I'm Jim Waddell, and I'm your host for Social Capital. I'm Assistant Vice President for Innovation and Technology Policy at the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities. And I'm also the staff director for the Commission on Innovation. Today's program is called Policies That Support Practice, What Government Does to Enable Innovation Ecosystems. We hear all the time that government should just get out of the way and let the private sector innovate. Could it be, though, that the government is the real risk taker that allows partnerships to grow and flourish in innovation ecosystems? Federal, state, and local policy may be at the heart of those innovation ecosystems. So what is the appropriate role for government in helping to create innovation ecosystems? How is the role for state government different from that of the federal government? How is the issue of risk an important factor when it comes to government engagement? And can innovation ecosystems really be made through government policy, or are such ecosystems actually born, or is it more organic? These are the kinds of questions we're going to explore today. And before I introduce my first guest, I'd like to invite all of you to participate in the conversation today. The way you do that is just type your question into the questions window. So on the control panel that you see that came up in GoToMeeting, you should see a place where it says questions. You just click on that to enter your questions, and we'll see your questions entered, and we will get to them as we can. So please do start asking questions at any time. They'll just go into a queue, and we'll pull them up as we get to them. So first, I'd like to introduce my first guest, and that is Dan Berglund. Dan is President and CEO of SSDI, which is a nonprofit organization that leads, supports, and strengthens efforts to improve state and regional economies through science, technology, and innovation. SSDI is the most comprehensive resource available for those involved in technology-based economic development. Leading SSDI since its inception in 1996, Dan has helped SSDI develop a nationwide network of practitioners and policymakers dedicated to improving the economy through science, technology, and innovation. SSDI works with this network to assist states and communities as they build tech-based economies, conduct research on best practices and trends in tech-based economic development, and encourage cooperation among and between state and federal programs. Prior to joining SSDI, Dan worked as a consultant and for the Ohio Department of Development in a variety of positions, including acting deputy director of the Division of Technological Innovation. Dan, thanks a lot for being with us for this conversation. Was wondering if you could start off by just telling us a little bit about SSDI and the role that the organization plays in helping to advance good policy and government engagement in support of innovation ecosystems.
Sure. I think we've got one slide that helps provide a little bit of a snapshot on SSDI. Jim did a good job providing background and description history on SSDI. What we do really breaks down into 4 different activity areas: information, education, research, and advocacy, all done under a philosophy that what we're trying to accomplish is encouraging best practices and sharing of information among our members and non-members in the tech-based economic development community. So in the area of information, we put out 2 weekly publications, the SSDI Weekly Digest, which provides the latest news on issues impacting those of us that are working to encourage economic growth through science, technology, and innovation. And then the funding supplement, which scans FedBiz Ops and various foundation funding opportunities, looking for any R&D related funding, consolidates that into one nice, simple newsletter. On education, we have an annual conference. We have a webinar series, and for 7 years, 8 years now, we've been running an awards program as well. And for those new to the field, the awards program in particular is a great place to start because we've highlighted about 50 organizations over the last several years on programs that their peers have selected as best in class. Research, we're always looking at trends in tech-based economic development, how the field is shifting. We're responding to questions that we get from our members on issues that are impacting them. Then we have a sizable set of activity. It's called the Regional Innovation Acceleration Network, which is funded by the Economic Development Administration, that really looks at the innovation ecosystem on a regional level. And then finally, we've been very active the last 3 years in advocacy work in D.C., on the Hill, and with the administration, primarily trying to identify and support new funding streams for technology-based economic development programs. And then final point that I would just make on background on SSDI is more than 150 state, local, and university organizations around the country are members of SSDI, and it's that great network willing to share what's worked for them and what hasn't worked that I think helps move the field along.
Thanks a lot, Dan. Maybe if you could just for a second talk a little bit more. I know I'm familiar with a lot of what SSDI has done on the federal level advocacy-wise. You know, our organizations stay in close touch about those things. I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about sort of the, and I also know that SSDI tracks a lot of what happens at the state policy level. Maybe you could say just a little bit more about sort of SSDI's you know, activity specifically around both state and federal level policy, since that's what we'll be talking about today.
So on the advocacy front, or?
Yeah, I mean, just, you know, both advocacy as well as just kind of, you know, SSDI I know is a great resource just to understand better what's going on at the state level in terms of policies that support this. So maybe just zeroing in on that for just a second.
Okay. So on the state level, and the annual cycle has already begun, what we do is we review every state budget that comes out, looking for programs that are going to have an impact on economic growth through science, technology, and innovation. So sometimes that is a technology-based economic development program in an economic development department. Sometimes it's workforce, primarily STEM issues at K through 12 or higher education. It could involve research capacity. So we're combing through the budgets to track both what existing programs are receiving or are proposed to receive, and also new initiatives that are being proposed as well. And then on top of that, every state of the state, we go through the address, every inaugural address, we go through to determine the priorities of the governor and the administration. And meanwhile, we're doing all sorts of news tracking through a variety of sources on what's happening on the legislative front at the state level. So we have a pretty strong tracking system in place. On the advocacy front, on the state level, it really varies from state to state. Our primary role is to support our members in individual states. So sometimes that means getting them information on what's occurring in other states. Sometimes that means traveling to those states in order to do briefings of legislators or governors or other elected officials on what current practice is in technology-based economic development. So it's a pretty robust set of activities that we're doing.
Great. Well, thanks for filling us in a little bit more on the policy role that SSDI plays. So I'd like to introduce our next guest now. I'm going to flip forward a couple slides here. Susan Sloan is the director of the Government University Industry Research Roundtable, or GWIR, at the National Academies. Before joining the National Academies in 2008, Susan had been executive in residence at the Center for Advancement of Scholarship in Engineering Education of the National Academy of Engineering and Chief Executive Officer of the Global Wireless Education Consortium, a university industry membership organization committed to the development and incorporation of current wireless technology curricula in academic institutions worldwide. Earlier in her career, Susan worked as Corporate Foundation Relations Consultant to the National Science Foundation's Division of Undergraduate Education, and also as Associate Director of the Master of Health Science and Health Policy Program at the Johns Hopkins University School of Public Health. Susan got her start in Washington, D.C., working as a staff assistant to Representative Timothy Wirth in the U.S. House of Representatives. Susan, thanks so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you, Jim, for that kind introduction, and Dan, for your great presentation. Thanks also to all of you out there who have elected to participate in today's webinar. We certainly appreciate the audience. So I'll spend just a few minutes describing the activities of the group that I direct, as well as two semi-autonomous affiliate organizations that fall under my group's administrative purview. All three of these entities are membership organizations that seek to advance the relationships between the sectors. And in addition to working mindfully on shared important problems, the groups collectively serve as catalysts, bringing together potential collaborators that might not otherwise gather. So we don't fall squarely in the innovation space. We're a bit beyond that, but we're all about partnerships, which certainly play into the innovation space. So I'll begin with the parent entity. The Government University Industry Research Roundtable, or GWIR, is a joint body of the National Academy of Sciences, National Academy of Engineering, and the Institute of Medicine, as Jim has mentioned, and it was established 30 years ago this year. It's a forum where senior leaders from the three constituent sectors, so in our case, government, university, and industry, can come together on an ongoing basis to explore ways to improve the productivity of the nation's science and technology enterprise. Our overarching objective is to try to understand the pressing STEM and innovation-related issues and associated challenges and opportunities. We hope to inject imaginative thought into the system, and we aim to provide a setting for the seeking of common ground. I should note that as a roundtable within the academies, GWIR does not make recommendations or offer specific advice. Because GWIR is allowed to engage federal officials behind closed doors, the Federal Advisory Committee Act, or FACA, specifically prohibits us from providing advice to the government. Thus, our role is again really in defining and exploring complex issues relevant to the research enterprise, but having those government leaders in the room along with senior officials from universities and companies, and all of those folks active in the dialogue. Often GWIR topical discussions will feed into current or future work for study boards within the academies or for external groups, or will spur action otherwise, such as prompting a congressional hearing or prompting a new agency RFA, a request for applications. So GWIR holds 3 general meetings per year, and the meeting topics are, as well as any of the targeted projects, are of the members' own choosing, often in response to national priorities. So in contrast to the deliberate long-term consensus reports that many of you folks may be familiar with out of the academies, and certainly they're the hallmark of most academy units, the Roundtable has the ability to reach out to a broader community in a broad range of activities. And indeed, I would say that we take great pride in our ability to be nimble, targeted, and agile. So the topics for our meetings are proposed by the members, as I've mentioned, and have been quite diverse. Our last meeting topic focused on the big data revolution and what it means for research. And here the group considered how big data is changing the way we do science, looking particularly at the challenges of working with and analyzing big data sets, some of the ethics and privacy concerns, workforce and training issues, the need for solid interagency coordination, and opportunities for public-private partnerships. And that public-private partnership is always something that permeates every GWIR discussion. So while acknowledgement was made in this big data discussion around the technical side of big data, our discussion focused primarily on the role of and impact of big data in scholarly research. In the meeting before that, so in June of this year, GWIR members considered how to optimize cross-sector and interdisciplinary partnerships, looking specifically at an emerging model of research and innovation called Convergence. And Convergence is the merging of previously distinct disciplines to create new disciplines, notably in the biological sciences, engineering, and computer science. So synthetic biology is a good example of convergence. There was considerable interest in this topic by the federal agency representatives, since many of today's research questions are not effectively addressed within the context of a single scientific discipline. For funding agencies like NSF, the question that they pose for us is how do we, so we being NSF then, how do we as a federal agency identify new areas of convergence? And a second question is how do we assess convergence-oriented proposals using the standard merit review process? So some very legitimate questions that need to be addressed. There are also issues for faculty members here. For example, how do we create flexible organizational structures to enable a convergence research paradigm shift? And how do we modify tenure and promotion processes so that faculty will be rewarded for taking risks in this new style of research? Our corporate partners, again sticking with this topic of convergence, spoke of how innovation in convergence requires a focus on adaptive science, with one company, Lockheed Martin, claiming to apply the concept of complex adaptive systems in fields such as robomorphics, biomimicry, synthetic biology, and nanosensors and fabrics. So this particular company has identified 20 top jobs that will soon exist but don't currently, and the company is working with university partners to help them understand the curriculum that will be needed to produce people who can meet these future workforce needs. And some examples of some of these top jobs, these jobs that this individual envisions for the future, are things like web archaeologist for the mapping of data. It ties back to our big data meeting, and personal privacy manager, which again, looking at the ethical piece of things. So as you can see, the meeting discussion is rich, and in this case, emphasized the development of transdisciplinary skills. Our topics really are varied, and they do come from the membership. So a sampling of other topics have included novel financing for innovation, so trying to figure out how you get over that valley of death, if you will, recognizing that the federal funds for basic science come at the front end, and the VC funds come at the far end of the spectrum when things are clearly commercializable. But how do we get over that, get through that spectrum there? We held a meeting on the patent system for new innovation ecosystem, looking, in this case, asking whether patents encourage or inhibit innovation. We had a meeting and discussion, robust discussion about reimagining the university and considering the high cost of education, and also what MOOCs, the massive open online courses, mean for the constituent sectors, government, university, and industry, and for education as a whole. We talked about the impact of social networking and crowdsourcing on research, the enterprise, and the workforce. We've had a meeting on charting a return to way out there research and risk-taking at the edges, recognizing that the United States is often more willing to take risks than other countries, but what are the boundaries around risk? And so there's a whole array of topics, and you can find written summary reports of all the GWIR meetings on our website if you're interested. We're also host a monthly webinar series, often showcasing particular federal government programs, many from NIH and NSF, but certainly other agencies too. And these webinars really help to showcase programs that spur translation of fundamental research and encourage productive entrepreneurship. So innovation and the establishment of innovation ecosystems is always at the core of this webinar series. The webinars are free, and the audio transcripts and the slides are posted as well online on the GWIR site. So let me move to this second activity, the FDP, that falls under GWIR's purview. FDP stands for the Federal Demonstration Partnership, and it's an association of federal agencies and academic research institutions that work collaboratively to streamline the administration of federally sponsored research. It offers a unique forum for representatives from research institutions, so both faculty and administrators, to work collaboratively with federal agency officials to improve the national research enterprise. We just moved into phase 5 with the FDP, and it now has 155 member institutions, including numerous emerging research institutions, and also 10 federal agencies, including NIH, NSF, the DoD, Army, Navy, Air Force, USDA, EPA, NASA, and others. So officials from these federal agencies report out at each of the 3 FDP meetings per year and provide information to faculty administrators on new reporting requirements and such. GWIR serves as the neutral committer for the FDP within the national academies. The FDP has been involved for nearly 28 years in efforts to reduce the administrative burdens facing institutions and principal investigators that receive federal funding to conduct scientific research. And as its name suggests, the FDP conducts demonstrations and pilot activities. And I would say that perhaps the most visible project is the faculty workload survey that was conducted first in 2005 and then again in 2012 as a means of documenting the continuing impact of federal regulations and requirements on the research process. The results of both of these surveys, the one in 2005 that had over 6,000 respondents and the one in 2012 that had over 13,000 respondents, were in fact startlingly similar. And the results, the results indicated that the researchers were estimating an average of 42% of their research time associated with federally funded projects is spent on meeting administrative requirements rather than conducting active research. So this is an astounding figure and something that FDP is working to roll back, to push back that percentage. Around the time that the FDP released the results of its 2012 survey, the National Science Board also undertook a similar study to try to assess administrative burden. And FDP's chair was subsequently invited to testify before 2 subcommittees of the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology in the U.S. House of Representatives. So FDP's work on reducing the administrative workload for federally funded research is certainly resonating with at least some members of Congress. Other FDP projects of note include an ARA Administrative Impact Survey, and some of you on the phone will or may recall that the American Recovery and Investment Act, ARA, funding provided an unprecedented opportunity for researchers at colleges and universities to receive funding for important research initiatives. But those funds were accompanied by new administrative requirements. So in 2011, the FDP published results of a survey conducted to document the impact. And the respondents of that particular survey suggested that the administrative costs averaged just under $8,000 per ARA award. So again, significant. The FDP has also conducted a pilot demonstration for STAR Metrics, which is a federal and research institution collaboration to create a repository of data and tools that will be useful to assess the impact of federal R&D investment. And as part of the STAR Metrics, we were trying to understand the number of jobs created through federally funded research activity. The NIH and the NSF, under the auspices of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, have been leading this particular project, STAR Metrics. So I think it's fair to say that FDP is supporting our nation's innovation ecosystem by streamlining federal processes and getting the academic researcher back to the bench. I should note here that several of my National Academies colleagues will soon undertake a new study of federal regulations and reporting requirements with specific attention to those directed at research universities. And the task, as I understand it, for this study is to develop a new framework for federal regulation of research universities. So you may want to stay tuned for that upcoming study. finally, let me just quickly introduce the University Industry Demonstration Partnership, or UIDP, and this is the other activity that falls under the mantle of GWIR. Although in the middle of next year, it will graduate from GWIR's incubation as a project within the academies and spin off as its own independent organization. GWIR is very proud of the steady growth and many accomplishments of this particular entity in its short 8-year history. So what is the UIDP? UIDP is a project-oriented organization where members from companies and universities identify issues impacting university and industry relations and then seek bold, innovative approaches to addressing the challenges while working together. The goal is to enhance the environment for university-industry partnerships and research collaborations in the United States. So very simply, the UIDP works to remove barriers and catalyze university-industry collaborations. The UIDP has a well-defined project process and a very impressive portfolio of current and completed projects, with about 18 projects currently in their pipeline. And these projects are all proposed by the members. Its initial project was a web-based decision tree software product called Turbo Negotiator, but that has led to the development of a set of 15 printed contract accords. And the accords provide practical guidance and detailed reference materials to help parties understand and address challenges in negotiating collaborative research agreements. The accords address an array of topics such as statement of work, indemnification, publications, background IP, foreground IP, export control, copyright and software, material transfer agreements, confidential disclosure agreements, all sorts of topics. So these are all important elements and possible points of contention that may come up in the negotiation process when a company and a university are trying to establish a strategic partnership. So providing some sense of what might be expected from each side at the outset and understanding the different perspectives can certainly help and even potentially speed up the process of partnering. The contract accords are a mainstay, but the UIDP has also developed and published a researcher guidebook intended as a guide for successful institutional industrial collaborations. It has developed a partnership continuum that illustrates the myriad points of university-industry intersection and the ways in which the relationship can develop over time and with increasing trust. With the partnership, the arrow on the partnership continuum moves upward as the relationship goes from shared tactics to shared ideas to shared aspirations. And yet another project looks at new models for university-industry collaboration, profiling 8 universities with novel approaches to industry-sponsored research and associated IP assignment. So I don't want to go too much further into the full set of active projects, but I think you can appreciate the efforts of UIDP and of the other 2 groups that I've described, FDP and GWIR, as facilitating entities within the innovation space.
Yeah,
so I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks very much, Susan. Yeah, clearly both clearly both SSDI and GWIR are doing quite a bit to kind of help us or help foster these kinds of innovation ecosystems. And also, it sounds like both organizations are very much engaged in kind of advancing the government role and government engagement in supporting innovation ecosystems. So I'd like to talk more with you both about that idea that public policy can support and enable innovation ecosystems. Before we jump into our conversation, though, I want to remind our participants today that we'd really like for all of you to join in this conversation. And so I encourage you to please send us your questions. Just click on that questions button on the control panel on your GoToWebinar screen. And you should just be able to pull up a window where you can enter your questions, and we'll get those questions in a queue, and we'll get to them as we can as we continue the discussion. So please do give us your questions. Let us know if you have questions about SSTI or GWIR, or if other questions come to you as we continue the conversation. So maybe we could start just by talking a little bit about some a little bit kind of what the federal government has done by way of supporting and stimulating regional innovation ecosystems. And there have been a variety of federal programs that have focused on ecosystem development. The I-6 Challenge grants from EDA, Regional Innovation Systems, the National Network for Manufacturing Innovation, There have been some agency kinds of programs like I-Corps out of NSF. And so I'd just love to hear from, maybe we'll start with you, Dan, just your familiarity with these programs. What do you feel has been about these programs, or maybe you want to focus on a particular one? What's been effective about the programs in terms of stimulating the establishment of innovation ecosystems or the growth of those ecosystems? And what could we be doing better in these kinds of programs?
Sure. Well, let me start actually by providing a framework for what an innovation ecosystem is.
Great idea.
To make sure that we're all on the same page as we're talking about this. So for us, what we're looking at is a combination of factors that all come into play in order to develop that ecosystem. So that means that you have research capacity, either at university or company, preferably both. You've got mechanisms for the commercialization of research. You've got a technically skilled workforce that can make all of this come together. You've got sources of capital to help seed the growth of companies. You've got strong entrepreneurship, an entrepreneurial culture, and you have a physical infrastructure that's in place in order for the whole system to work. So when we think about the system, I think one of the challenges on the federal level has been more of the federal support has gone to individual components of an innovation ecosystem rather than something that will provide support to bring those individual elements together. So, for example, over the years, really strong, effective programs on individual elements have included the SBIR program that helps address the capital issue, the Industry University Cooperative Research Center program at NSF, which helps with both the research capacity and getting that information into the private sector, the Manufacturing Extension Partnership at NIST. More recently, the feds have moved into a little bit more of the system thinking, and so the Regional Innovation System program is something that SSDI has really been focused on the last couple of years, because we're interested in how do you get all of these pieces to work together. And this is the first federal program that we've seen that we think has the potential of providing that funding for that kind of system building. So, Jim, actually, if you could go to the one timeline slide to start with, that would be, yeah, that highlights of the Regional Innovation Program. So this is a very new program. In essence, it was actually authorized in 2010 through the America Competes Act, but nothing happened with the program. There were a couple congressional advocates. The administration would propose funding for the program, but was not successful. And so this became our main target of advocacy work in DC. So you see on the left-hand side, it shows sort of key timeline points for the program itself, and on the right-hand side, you'll see a number of the activities that we've undertaken over the last few years. And the bottom line is there was just on the street a federal funding opportunity for the first time, funding of $15 million for the Regional Innovation Program through the Economic Development Administration. One of the reasons that we really like this program for its potential, and because it's just received its first funding, and applications were submitted at the beginning of this month. So we don't don't know who the winners are, so we don't have results from this program. But what we're encouraged about with this program is that it does take more of a systems approach rather than an individual component approach. And because it was authorized under the America Competes Act, it's much more flexible than the typical Economic Development Administration program, which requires that funding flow only to distressed areas and has to go through the regional office infrastructure. The Regional Innovation Program is different. It is administered out of headquarters, and distressed area doesn't come into play. So we think having this pool of flexible funding is going to be important. The size of the pool of funding is not nearly as large as we would like or think is needed, but it's a start. I think some of the other programs, Jim, that you mentioned, NNMI and I-Corps, are interesting and good programs, but have some particular challenges to them. So NNMI, I think, is going to be a really interesting experiment to see what the results end up being out of this university, industry, federal government cooperation focused on a few particular technology areas. But the challenge from an ecosystem perspective is that the administration lacking clear authorizing language for this program has had to do it under the existing authorization under the Department of Energy and Department of Defense, which means that it's not going to, it's going to be focused on those missions rather than focused on an economic development or ecosystem approach. The I-Corps program, which I think is a very interesting experiment, and I'm encouraged by, my only, for those that aren't familiar with it, it's essentially a program based on a lean startup model that encourages education of faculty, researchers, and graduate students on the commercialization process. And the only thing that I'm a little bit nervous about with that program is if we focus on its main goal being a better understanding of the commercialization process, I think the program will be a success. What I'm concerned about is a lot of the press that the program gets tends to focus more on startups that are going to be spun out of universities. And I'm concerned that may be setting a bar that is unrealistic for this program. But in general, I'd say the good news is the last several years, we've seen much more interest in the federal government on attempting to address this issue and looking at it more from a systems viewpoint rather than just a mission-oriented viewpoint.
I think that raises a good point, and actually a question that we've gotten, I think, is directly related to this. So if I could just kind of push you a little bit more on this, Dan. Terry Woodworth has asked us, how is system thinking encouraged in terms of how funding is distributed among all of these different system players, pointing out that the large administrative burden is certainly a deterrent to having those budgets split effectively among the various system components, or is the administrative burden deterrent to having those budgets split among all the different components?
Yeah, no, I think that's the real challenge, is that the administration and Congress have created programs and appropriated funding using existing authorizing language rather than creating new language. And so there are a number of square pegs going into round holes, and as a result, the the number of programs that have the flexibility. Karen Mills, who is administrator of the Small Business Administration, used to talk about the problem with supporting cluster development, for example, is no one's willing to provide funding for the glue, the part of the system that focuses on connecting these individual elements. That's a real challenge. SBA should definitely get a tip of the hat for the very limited money that they've had to provide support to 11, I think now, regional innovation cluster organizations around the country, and they're actually providing some of that glue money. But we need more pots of money that are on the glue rather than on the individual elements.
Yeah, it seems to me that really we're talking about a kind of fundamental shift in the way we think about public policy, because, as you say, certainly at the federal level, in any case, and we can talk a little bit more about state-level policy in a minute, but at the federal level, it's always been directed, as you pointed out, to these different pieces. So, Susan, I'm wondering what your perspective on this is. How do we kind of shift, and what's been your experience through the conversations that GWIR has convened? How do we shift into this thinking about funding in a more ecosystem kind of way? In other words, funding that provides opportunities across the different components that Dan laid out earlier, and or provides for some of this glue kinds of activity that our current ways of thinking about policy aren't really doing.
I think that's a very good question. I'm not sure we have answered it, frankly, and you know, having heard Dan's response to this, I'm actually grateful that he's out there advocating on our behalf, our collective behalf, because here at the academies we don't have that advocacy role. You know, I guess I'm more familiar with these various programs in a piecemeal fashion, which of course doesn't get to the systems approach at all. You know, I've looked very carefully at the NSF I-Core program, the I-6 Challenge, the NCATS program. There's a whole array of new ones at NIH, so NCATS and NCAI, the National Centers for Accelerated Innovation. There's an NINDS Create Bio program that we just featured in a GWIR webinar recently. So these are mainly programs that are encouraging translation of research. And you know, I guess in a broad sense, you know, I see a lot of benefit to some of these things. I'm encouraged by this particular administration rolling out a lot of these kinds of programs, but I don't think there's any coordination. And to my knowledge, there's no institution that evaluates the research enterprise as a whole, so it assesses its performance for that matter. And so you know, there's a need there at the very top for sort of a national innovation policy, I would argue. But in terms of just these various programs, I think there's some components that are very good. For example, it provides business development expertise and introduction to the commercialization process. It helps in connecting external communities. It helps to determine what might be commercially relevant. So you know, I think it helps determine, you know, maybe what has a better chance to be successful, and it allows opportunities for federally funded researchers to collaborate with suppliers and companies. It lets people learn or glean knowledge about what the market needs are, which I think is important. I mean, particularly NSF, the NSF I-Core program. One aspect that I really like about it is it provides a blueprint for going through the process. So, what market are you in? What is your product? Who is your customer? But again, you know, I guess for better or worse, I've been mired in the intricacies of it, and I haven't thought about it in a broader, systematic approach, which I think is really critical.
Yeah. Well, I think that idea of the need for kind of more support for thinking about the ecosystem as a system, you know, is a really important one. And Dan, what I'm wondering, do you see this being handled differently at the state level? Are states better able in any way to address the kind of system approach for these kinds of policies, or are they facing the same kinds of challenges that the federal government faces in creating good policy for ecosystems?
No, I think the states historically, and this isn't true obviously for all 50 states, and nothing is true for all 50, but broadly speaking, I would say that the states that are leaders in this activity do tend to look at it more as to how the individual components all tie together, and also look at areas where their economy is weak and where it makes sense for government to intervene. So if you take a look at the Ohios, the Pennsylvanias, the Michigans, over the years, they've all invested in things ranging from research enterprise capacity to commercializing research to capital. So great example of this is the Georgia Research Alliance, which got started around 1990, and the business community decided we really need to strengthen the research capacity of Georgia's universities. So their primary focus initially was on recruiting eminent scholars and building the research capacity of the universities. As they made progress there, then the question became, okay, how can we commercialize more university research and get it into the marketplace? So they developed one of the first proof of concept funds and programs, Venture Lab, which has had really good success in getting university research into the marketplace. Okay, now that you've created these companies, do you have the capital in the state to be able to support that? And so GRA has evolved again in helping establish some seed capital funds in the state as well. So there's much less reluctance on the state level to look at the big picture than there has been on the federal level. Susan, I think, very appropriately said we need a national innovation policy, and that's something that tends to scare Congress and in general doesn't scare governors and state legislatures.
Well, I think it's promising to hear that you know, that states are able to be sort of more nimble when it comes to thinking in this way. It does seem to me like it's going to have, you know, we have to have more of a balance between, and certainly I think at the federal level, having something, as you both said now, a national innovation policy will be really important to stimulate some of this at both the federal and state level. So, you know, I think it's, we talk a lot about what's the appropriate federal role. I think we have to talk about that in the context of what are states doing and what's the appropriate state policy role and how do those interact. So, you know, it's kind of following. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, go ahead, Susan.
I'm not even sure there's a systematic innovation partnership between the federal government and the state and local governments.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So you know, I think state and local efforts, you know, they're pushing hard, but they still remain underfunded.
Right.
Actually, I would have, if I'm allowed to ask a question to Dan,
yeah.
You know, I'd actually be curious to know whether states see other states as competitors, or are they increasingly working as partners?
So that's a great question, and actually it's part of what I love about the technology-based economic development field that I'm in, where for the most part states and regions see each others as collaborators rather than as competitors, because in general, if your focus is going to be on building your ecosystem and growing your own economic activity, if you're in Atlanta, there's no harm if Chicago's doing the same thing. And if Birmingham is doing it, even better, because that means that there might be more interplay between the two economies that are going to benefit each other. So it's different from what I think is the popular conception of what economic development is, which is let me recruit an auto plant to my state. And in that case, states and regions are absolutely competitors against each other. But in this growing your own, it's much more about sharing and looking for areas to connect.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think we have to think about that idea of competition very differently as well,
right.
In ecosystem kind of thinking. We do have a few minutes left, and I do want to encourage participants to, if you have burning questions, submit them, and we'll get them into the conversation here. Cameron McCoy has a question that I'm going to try to sort of reshape here, Cameron, and if I'm off the mark, let me know. But you talked about a number of different components, Dan, of the innovation ecosystem, and we frequently talk to universities and talk about the sort of role that universities can play as kind of conveners and anchors institutions within innovation ecosystems. They're very place-based. They're not going anywhere, and they have a special role that they can play, we think, not just because of the research capacity and the technology that comes out of universities, but also just the fact that universities contribute to workforce and talent development. They also contribute to place development, social, cultural, community development kinds of things, which I think are also part of that innovation ecosystem, because we know that if we're going to have a thriving business community, you've got to have a great place to live and so forth. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to the idea that it's not just we have to think across a broader array of activities around innovation and entrepreneurship. We may even have to think beyond innovation and entrepreneurship. Certainly you've mentioned the workforce piece, but also even cultural and place kinds of things. I'm wondering if you could talk about the fact that those are parts of the innovation ecosystem, and whether or not policy helps influence those, or is it really just the institutions at the local level that influence those other kinds of aspects of the ecosystem?
Yeah, no, I mean, the social and cultural absolutely play into development of innovation ecosystem. Frequently I'll talk about quality of life as being one of the other elements, but it's a little difficult to talk about because it's so squishy in terms of being able to measure it.
Right.
But no, that absolutely plays a role, in particular with workforce. And as the economy moves into a fuller recovery and the bargaining power shifts to the worker over the employer, people will migrate to places that they want to live and that have the amenities and the kind of culture that they want to live in. And universities absolutely play a role in all of these areas. The one exception possibly in capital, but even in capital, we're seeing more proof of concept funds being established, the creation of funds focused on investing in companies that alumni of universities is becoming much more common. And so there's definitely, universities transcend each of these categories. I think the challenge is universities, institutions of higher education need to really assess what is on the ground, who the actors are in the space already, and where we're seeing really successful programs and approaches is where universities are partnering with other organizations. So again, using Georgia as an example, the partnership between Georgia Tech and the Georgia Research Alliance, I suspect both of those organizations would say they couldn't do it without the other organization. And of course, the other higher education innovation institutions in Georgia as well. It's not just a Georgia Tech, but Georgia Tech gets a lot of the attention. So it's figuring out how to collaborate, and I think there can be a tendency on large universities in particular to feel that they need to take the lead on everything, where their more appropriate role may be in supporting in some functions and supporting existing organizations.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think that we've learned a lot about how we talk with universities in terms of their role. And you know, the word convener, I think we've used a lot, and we try to avoid an interpretation of the word convener of leader, because what we know is that that's not what it's about. It's really about, I think as you said, identifying the existing assets and the existing activities, and really trying to, you know, maybe even provide some of that glue kind of function that you talked about earlier. I'm curious whether you have a perspective on this as well, Susan, in terms of the different aspects of the ecosystem and the ways in which, and not just universities, but you know, universities and I think industry in particular kind of tend to bring different pieces of it to the table. And again, I guess the question is whether or not whether the role for policy can reach into some of these broader aspects of innovation ecosystems like culture and social development. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that based on GWIR conversations.
I'm not sure I can contribute heavily there. It's you know, certainly federal investments have been made in infrastructure, so housing and transportation and the like, and that's critical in any innovation cluster area. But even that funding hasn't been, at federal level, hasn't been reliable and hasn't been consistent due to budget cuts and legislative drift and the like. So, but I think that establishing the culture and I'm not sure I can contribute there.
Okay, no, that's great. Well, we're just about out of time, but I did want to just ask one more question, which is, you know, we hear a lot that, you know, I think we heard this a lot when the conversations were largely about cluster development, and there was a lot of pointing to Silicon Valley and the Route 128 corridor in Massachusetts, and people saying, you know, policy doesn't create those things. Policy didn't create Silicon Valley, and public policy didn't create the Route 128 corridor, that it's much more organic, that innovation ecosystems kind of grow up on their own, or they're kind of born, not created. I'm curious, just, you know, very briefly, each of you, if you could share your thoughts on your perspective on we know that policy does play a role, but to what extent is policy kind of sort of seeding this organic growth versus bringing it together once it's gotten started? What is the role of policy when we know that at least part of it is about an ecosystem being born, not created? Dan?
Wow.
Yeah.
It's such a big question for such a short period of time. I guess what I would say is you can't have an ecosystem that's born just out of policy. I think the Soviet Union is a testament to that. So there has to be something that is there and that is going to come together. But the flip side of that is, if you look at Research Triangle in North Carolina, I'm not sure I can think of a better example of a conscious policy decision made by a state to do something and ultimately having success with it, although it took decades. And I also get very frustrated with, and this isn't what you were saying, Jim, but I'm going to take it in a slightly different tangent, of people saying Silicon Valley and Route 128 occurred without any government intervention at all. I mean, anybody that's read Annalise Saxenian's wonderful book, Regional Advantage, gets a full picture of just how much defense spending really helped shape the creation of Silicon Valley and Route 128. So while there might not have been a policy-conscious decision to create something like those two entities, there was government action that absolutely played a fundamental role in the creation of those ecosystems.
Good point. So it may not have been ecosystem policy, but there was policy that played a role. Susan, do you have any thoughts about that?
I think I would just say that the most important role is to promote the conditions for the research to thrive. And the government dollars obviously are going in to support that, as Dan just mentioned with the book Regional Advantage. But the government role, whether it's supportive or directive, is kind of the big question. And I would say in the case of the innovation ecosystems and clustering, I mean, it really ought to come more, or it seems to be more effective when grown organically and coming up from the states as opposed to a top-down sort of approach.
Yeah, I think these are all good points. So policy is kind of connective tissue, but it has to be for things that are in existence and underway already. Well, I can't believe it, but we're out of time. So I'd like to say thank you very much to you both, Dan and Susan, for joining us today. I'd like to encourage folks who've been participating today to learn more about the Commission on Innovation if you don't already know about it. If you visit www.aplu.org/SciCep. You can also follow us on Twitter at APLU Innovation. And there is a link there to find us on LinkedIn as well. And you can email me anytime at jwaddell@aplu.org. And I also want to say thank you to those of you who participated throughout the year in our social capital webinars. Watch for announcements about what we're going to be doing with the webinars in 2015. And in the meantime, to review any of the webinars that we did this past year, you can go to this link, bit.ly or bit.ly/APLU Social Capital, and that'll take you right to the YouTube channel where the social capital webinars, the recordings of all of our webinars have been posted. Thank you very much, and thanks again to you both, Susan and Dan, for being here today.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, and we'll see you all next time. Bye-bye now.